Hi guys, I picked up this board of African mahogany from Home Depot. It's 3/4 of an inch thick, 12 inches wide, and about 18 inches long. I went ahead and drew out with a pencil and then a pen the outline of the charcuterie board that I want to make. And I'm going to start carving the outline with the Dremel 561 multi-purpose cutting bit at 25,000 RPM. I'm still using a flex shaft connected with a Dremel 4300, but any Dremel or rotary tool should work for this project. The flex shaft is useful to minimize hand fatigue, but it's not really necessary. I'll link every accessory and product I use for this in the description. Right off the bat, I'll say there are faster and easier methods of making a board like this, but this video is important to me because I want to show you how you can make something cool at home without the arsenal of tools that you see in most woodworking tutorials. So I'll be using this tool and this tool only, no jigsaws, routers, planers, or sanders necessary. Now that we have a very rough outline of the board, I'm switching to this Kutzall Extreme Flame Burr to clean up the sides, again at 25,000 RPM, getting as close to the lines as possible without beveling the board. Now that the shape looks good, I'm drawing an outline with the board about 1/3 of an inch away from the edge to give me some reference for when I make the bevel. I'm staying with the Kutzall Extreme to create the bevel, and I'm only doing one side of the board at a time, creating a 45-degree edge without any rounding. After I did the top side, I did the same with the back side. For the design of the board, I'll be putting some numbers in the corner, which I printed out and taped down. And I drew out a river design that goes across the entire board for the epoxy we'll add later. The epoxy will go all the way to the edge and only be about half the depth of the board. Once again, I used the Kutzall Extreme to begin carving out the river design, but I left a little room between the lines since the Kutzall isn't very precise. To get a precise line for the edges of the design, I'm using the Dremel 562 tile cutting bit, as you can get a smooth, deep cut with it. And as a rule of thumb for any wood carving, I usually stay at 25,000 RPM. I also use the 562 to cut out the numbers, as it's thin enough for carving the design and getting the right depth. I start with scoring the outline of the design through the paper until I can remove the paper and have the numbers still clearly visible. I can then carve the depth that I need. My Kutzall was going slower than I wanted, and the flame shape wasn't perfect for this application, so I tried a couple different tungsten carbide cutting burrs, but they were just about as effective as the Kutzall. I carefully went along the lines carving in so that the edges of the design stayed clean and straight down, and then I carved some wells in the middle to make carving it out faster and more consistent for the depth. I ended up going back to the Kutzall Extreme to flatten out the grooves I just made and to make the bottom of the design fairly level. The Kutzall is fast to carve out a lot of material, but it leaves a very rough finish, so I went back with the tungsten carbide cutting bits to go over the surface again, since they leave a smoother finish, which can make the sanding easier later. We can start sanding now. I started with 220 grit sandpaper, just doing hand sanding, but I got lazy and used the Dremel sanding drum at 15,000 RPM around the edges, just to round them off. After sanding up to 220 on the edges I used a polishing wheel on the inside of the design. This green one is about 180 grit. I use these polishing wheels since they remove any strands of wood hanging on within the design, since I don't want them to detach and float in the epoxy once we add it later. Since they're not very durable, I usually drop down to 10,000 RPM. I also use the polishing wheel to soften the edges of the numbers, but it couldn't fit into the bottom of the design, so I moved on to the Dremel 84922. I use this accessory to grind off any roughness in hard-to-reach places. Now we can add the epoxy. I brought the board inside and propped it up on one side with a sticky note to make sure it was level. I also use Scotch tape on both sides of the design so that the epoxy doesn't flow out and onto the table. I'll be using this clear epoxy I found on Amazon, and these two mica-based colored powders, also from Amazon. I'll link them all in the description. After pouring the 1-to-1 ratio for the resin and the hardener, I added a small amount of each pigment, mix them in. I use the shiny pigment as opposed to a transparent dye, since the design doesn't go through the entire board, so I don't want the wood to be visible through the epoxy. After checking that the board is level one last time, we can get to pouring. I didn't really have a method for the pouring, and I didn't think it would matter since I was going to add a swirly design to the epoxy afterwards anyways. I didn't end up mixing enough, so I poured a small second batch and then tried to match the same color as the first batch. It wasn't exactly the same, so I used a plastic knife to mix it in and give the epoxy a textured look. I then used a blowtorch to pop any bubbles on the top of the epoxy, and I let the epoxy set for 24 hours before I continued working on it. Epoxy brands are all different though, so make sure to follow their instructions for the mixing ratios and the setting times if you're doing this on your own. Here we are with the epoxy all set. I'm going to put my initials on the back really quick before I level the epoxy. I'm using the Dremel 111 since it's thin and long enough, so it's perfect for small engravings. Okay, for the dreaded sanding, I started with hand sanding with 220 grit sandpaper. The hand sanding was taking way too long, so I switched to a sanding disc on the Dremel that also had 220 grit. I went through several of the discs to make sure that all the epoxy that had overflown out of the design was removed and that the epoxy was level with the wood. Since the 220 grit sandpaper took off the smooth finish of the epoxy, I went back with a 320 grit polishing wheel to get some of the scratches out. I then used the polishing wheel that came with the Dremel along with the buffing compound, which worked really well to make the epoxy look glossy again. I sanded the entire board front and back with a 400 grit polishing wheel to make sure it was smooth, and then went back with the polishing compound to make sure that the epoxy looked good. After sanding, I soaked the board for a couple seconds in water and let it air dry to allow the grain to raise, and then I sanded it a final time with 1000 grit sandpaper. After one last touch-up with the polishing compound, I rubbed the excess compound off with a paper towel, and then it was finally ready to oil. I used Howard Butcher Block conditioner, which has a mix of food-safe mineral oil and beeswax, and put a thick coating on before rubbing it in with a paper towel. The color of the African mahogany really was a treat to see with the oil, and came out a lot more orange than I expected. Well, here's the final product. It's amazingly smooth, the wax gave it a really nice sheen, and the epoxy is still pretty glossy. And overall, I'm really happy with this project, especially since I only had to use one tool. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, comment, or subscribe if you enjoyed this video, since it helps out the channel a lot. And make sure to check out the rest of my videos if you're interested in power wood carvings and Dremel projects. See you next time.